We have a very good article that is written by James Spencer, Technological Advancements for the Good or Doom of Society, Social Media, Artificial Intelligence, a number of issues about that. That is available on our website. Let me hold up a couple of booklets that we would be glad to make available to you as well. One that came out a couple of years ago on social media, some of the concerns that you might want to know about as a parent or a grandparent. And then the one that was just mailed recently on the whole issue of artificial intelligence. These are important issues that we're going to have to think about here in the 21st century. And one of the reasons I always love to call on James Spencer, because he's had a chance to kind of think through some of these issues. He is a theologian and a Christian leader, earned his doctorate in theological studies from the Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, is the current president of the D.L. Moody Center, and we have a link to that website, moodycenter.org. You can find that information on our website at pointofview.net. So, James Spencer, welcome back to Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
You start off with the American Psychological Association. Not always that either you or I quote them as a reliable source, since we recognize some of those individuals may disagree with us on some of the moral issues. But they are recognizing that this whole issue of social media is a real concern. And so they issued a health advisory with a number of recommendations about social media. What have you learned?
Well, I think, number one, they are very careful with how they sort of talk about social media and what populations it actually impacts. So what the research is really demonstrating is that certain populations within social media users are really very prone to having adverse effects. Teenage girls is probably the most well-known one. That came out when Facebook's files came out. We saw that a lot of adolescent, teenage, preteen girls were being adversely affected by the images they were seeing, for instance, on Instagram, and starting to develop depressive syndrome symptoms, as well as maybe some body image issues related to the images they were seeing there on Instagram. And so a lot of those are sort of doctored images. They're polished and photoshopped. And they present more of an unrealistic picture of reality than actual reality. And so what this APA research really does show is that, number one, social media has some adverse effects, and we're multiple decades into social media at this point. And so just now noticing that it has some negative side effects for certain populations shouldn't give us a sigh of relief that everybody else is safe. It may very well just mean that we haven't seen what the negative side effects are for other populations. Number two, they give some good recommendations on what we can do to sort of curtail and minimize or mitigate against those adverse consequences. But I would say that one of the things that they miss is just getting off social media altogether, at least for a time.
Yes.
And I do mean at least for a time. I think there's a necessity to reset our expectations in life away from social media, and that one of the crucial first steps that I would recommend to any parent, any individual who's trying to step away from this, is just get rid of it for a certain period of time, 7 days, 10 days, 15 days, 30 days, whatever it is. But step away from it and start recognizing that you do not need this as an essential part of your life.
Let me put you on the spot for just a minute, because you do that. You're vulnerable, and you say, look, the issue that the American Psychological Association and all sorts of other groups as well, the American Academy of Pediatricians and the Journal of American Medical Association and all the rest, to point out some of the concerns. And you have taken some of the same steps that were recommended by the APA advisory, and you found that just didn't seem to be working very well.
Correct. I mean, I think when we tried this with our kids, this would have been back when they were, my daughters would have been 9 or 10. And so this was, 4 or 5 years ago. We started noticing that Instagram was having an adverse effect on one of our daughters. And so what we did was we just cut it off. But before we did that, we were doing a lot of the same steps that the APA was recommending. I think the difficulty is that policing things is just difficult. Policing anything, right? Crime, speeding, you name it. There's always going to be people who get away with it. And I think with these platforms, that if parents are going to try to police them, it's almost a lost cause. And what we found worked best for us was to pull the platforms back and just say, we're not going to have these be a part of your lives or our lives. We then sort of brought them back in as we needed them, as they had a more narrow use case that we felt we could control and monitor from the start. So, for instance, we have now a shared Instagram account with our kids. And so they don't really see anything that we're not seeing. They don't post anything that we're not posting. And we have very few followers and are following very few people. And so, there are ways, I think, to do it, but we had to really stop and then start off on the right foot to get it right.
One of the other issues that you point out is how the technology moves very quickly, and it's difficult for things to catch up. And I've talked about this in terms of everything from biology and bioethics and genetic engineering and all sorts of issues of social media, because you point out that now we're getting the advisory coming from the APA, but you take us through the history. Twitter released its retweet function in 2009. Facebook added comments section in 2008 and the like button in 2009. Instagram launched its standalone platform in 2010. So in some respects, here we are in 2023, and this is in some cases 13 or 14 years later. And then they go, wait a minute, I think we got an issue here.
Yeah, and the reason that I cite those three in particular, those seem to be the triggers for when social media became really problematic. If you read any work like Coddling of the American Mind, it's by
Jonathan Haidt.
Jonathan Haidt. Thank you.
Yeah.
If you look at his research, those functions seem to be what really create major problems with these platforms, and so. Those came out, we've been dealing with these now for a little bit more than a decade, and now the APA is finally just realizing that they have negative side effects. And I think the real problem that I want to highlight for everybody is just we're now moving into an age of artificial intelligence, and we're taking the same approach, or technology companies with our use are taking the same approach as was taken with social media. We're wading into this. We're using artificial intelligence. We're doing things with it, but we have no idea what the adverse side effects are going to be. And we seem to be okay being experimented on. We seem to be okay with tech companies, sort of putting this out there, allowing us to play with it, gathering our data, figuring out how to optimize it, and really having no accountability and no responsibility. And I'm just wondering, I'm not anti-technology, but I do think that process matters. And I think that if we repeat this process, if we repeat the process that we just got through with social media, I think we'll find ourselves in the next decade or so with, if it's not the APA, it'll be some other organization that's saying, oh, this had an app on what it means to be human. and if we just thought it through a little bit, we probably would have realized it.
Let me just mention that one of the quotes I used early on in our booklet on social media goes all the way back to 2008, which you've already heard us talk about, and it's by Nicholas Carr when he was writing this in Atlantic, which had the title, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And he says, over the past few years, I've had this uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. And he talked about the fact later on when he wrote the book, The Shallows, which came out a couple of years later, which was really a focus on the threat of the media and everything like that, that he went on to say that, it used to be that I was able to concentrate and really focus. He says, now once I was like a scuba diver in a sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. So here, even back in 2008, and then later when he published the book, The Shallows, a few years later, what the internet is doing to our brains, there were people saying, I think we have a social experiment taking place that is not healthy for our brains. Now we know that that is the case. Let me just mention something that comes from our good friend Gary Bauer. His end-of-day report talked about Instagram. Now, the vast majority of Instagram users are under the age of 35. The reason it's not skewed even further than that is due to the fact that a few old guys like me do use Instagram in one way or another. But let's go back to the facts. The Wall Street Journal the other day, working with two specialized internet research teams, this was at Stanford University and the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, was able to quickly identify more than 400 Instagram accounts that sold child pornography. 400. And they aren't necessarily concluding that they got all of them. They were able to determine that just a quarter of those accounts had more than 20,000 followers. Now, lest you think that that was a big surprise, Meta, which again is the company that Mark Zuckerberg has founded, because that covers more than just Facebook now, knows it has a problem because the company spokesperson admitted to taking down, are you ready for this? 490,000 accounts for violating its child safety policies just in January alone. About ready to part my ways from Instagram, though it has been a great resource sometimes for things. And I love what Gary Bauer says. You know, Mark Zuckerberg should be in front of a congressional hearing today, but instead we're talking about the indictment of the former President Donald Trump. And he brings this up because Tucker Carlson, as you may well know, has been out there, even though he's not with Fox News anymore, speaking to some of the issues of the sexualization of children. But here's one good example. And just a minute ago, James, we were talking about Instagram, and these numbers are just mind-boggling, and it illustrates again how really out of control the social media is. So at a time when they're preventing people from getting true information out on social media, they seem to be turning a blind eye to what I think most people would agree is child pornography.
Well, I think this is part of the problem with the democratization of these platforms. Democracies work as long as the people who use them are moral. And because these social media companies have been allowed to call themselves platforms as opposed to publishers, there isn't any clear way to regulate what's been going on. And I think that's why there hasn't been as clear an action taken on a legislative or a governmental level, because this whole confusion over platform versus publisher has been problematic. Now, these companies, they have to know that they have problems, as you noted. They've been taking been taking these accounts down. But I think the bigger issue is, if we look at the internet as a whole, out of the top 20 sites that are visited, I believe it was 5 that were pornography sites in 2022. Mm-hmm. And so we're all reaping the benefits of the internet. I have this sense that the internet is actually beneficial for all of us. And so what we have to start thinking about is, how beneficial is it really? And are we really willing to continue taking on the downside of what it is that we're doing? This sort of accessibility for content that is sexualizing children, that is just, exploiting adults. Is this really what we want as a society? And is it worth the benefits that we're getting out of it?
That's right.
We don't really tend to ask ourselves that question. We want everyone else except for us to be regulated. And I think we have to start at some point taking responsibility for this. Like, we're the ones who use this machine. And as long as we continue using it, we're going to be, I think, to some degree responsible for what happens on it.
Well, again, you also talk about, of course, we've mentioned this many times before, it isn't just the harmful effects of it, even if it's just benign. It displaces very valuable things. And so I wanted to get you to speak to that issue with your kids, because all of a sudden, when they're not on these social media chat rooms and social media platforms and TikTok, which, by the way, now you have to put in a passcode when you reach the 60-minute mark. 60 minutes, oh my gosh. They could be doing things, I don't know, like reading, learning a musical instrument, playing sports, going for a walk, engaging with their friends. There are just a lot of issues that are being displaced, even when sometimes social media is a positive in a person's life.
That's right. And I think, when I think back about my childhood, we didn't have the internet. I didn't even have a computer when I went to college. I think I took like an old school word processor with a printer built in. And I made it through okay.
There you are.
These things were not necessities. You had friendships. You went outside, you played. You did all these other things that many of us will remember doing when we were kids, as opposed to being glued to a small glowing rectangle. And I think that's something we just need to reckon with. As technology becomes more and more a part of our lives, we have to realize that it's also squeezing out aspects of our lives that we've kind of forgotten. And so, my kids and I just took a trip this last week, and it was, very little social media. They didn't need their phones. Most of the stuff we did was outdoors, a lot of hiking, a lot of swimming, a lot of, those kind of activities. We loved it. It was a great week. Nobody needed the internet. I used my driving directions on my phone, and that was basically it. And so I think, overall, we've just got to remember that these things are crowding other aspects of our lives out. They're distracting us from really good things that can add value to our lives. And these platforms aren't always adding that value. Not saying they have no value. I'm saying that until we really reckon with what is our use case for social media, what are we using it for, as opposed to, well, everybody else is on it, so I guess I should be. That logic never played when, mom and dad would ask if your friend's jumping off a bridge, would you do it too? And yet with social media, we seem to have adopted that wholesale. And I think that there's a way for us to consider social media and say, there has to be a narrow use case for this in order for us to bother using it. If we can't find that narrow use case, we just need to get off it. There's no reason to have it in our lives if it brings no value.
Again, the article, which came out in Town Hall, but we've also posted it here, Technological Advancements for the Good or Doom of Society. And, of course, you take us through everything from social media to artificial intelligence. But let me, for just a minute, also mention, James, that, of course, they can go to the moodycenter.org. One of the articles there goes beyond that. It's entitled Cleaning Out Our Cupboards. Now, that's about a year old, but nevertheless, social media, mass media, Christian consumption of information, because you even talk about the fact that it also can maybe not only cause you to lose distractions, but even lose some weight.
That's right. Yeah. I use the analogy of my own personal weight loss. And basically, when I was trying to lose weight, I couldn't keep the Twinkies and the Oreos in the cupboard, right? Those had to go. And I think it's very much the same with the way we process information and the way we use media. If we're going to continue watching and listening and reading things that are creating stress and anxiety and anger, we're probably not going to get calmer or more peaceful. We're probably not going to exhibit those fruits of the Spirit very well, because we're constantly feeding the anger and the frustration and just the overall angst that society tends to sort of push in on us with.
Yes.
And I think we just have to get rid of some of that stuff. It's okay. I think one of the messages that I've conveyed to people, it's okay to be out of the loop on some things. Yes. We don't have to know everything about everything.
Because you always get people coming up here, have you heard about this or whatever? But I just wanted to, again, mention that people can not only find your article, but they can also, of course, find a link to moodycenter.org. And so appreciate you writing this article. Appreciate the fact that you have really been on really a point on a very important issue, and I'm sure we'll have some other times to talk. Thanks for joining us. We hope you appreciated our conversation today. For more information on what we talked about, check out the links in the description of this episode or go to our website, pointofview.net. If you like this episode, follow us, tell a friend, and rate us so that we can continue bringing you the best highlights from Point of View. We'll see you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.